Have you ever caught yourself thinking that everyone around you seems to know everything about some people but in fact, they know almost nothing? Here he is, right next to me, in every city in Europe. In songs, in fairy tales, in horror stories, in movies. A people who have been living in plain sight for centuries and at the same time remain like a shadow. Roma, who are often called gypsies in Russian. There are more legends about them than about many kings. They tried to write them down as the Egyptians, then as people without a homeland, then as descendants of disappeared tribes, then as eternal aliens. Now imagine, there is a way that doesn't believe in myths. He doesn't read gossip, does not argue with prejudice. He just opens the cell and looks at what is written in the molecular memory. Today we have a DNA investigation where the stakes are particularly high. Because it's not just a story about origin. This is a story about how a nation can walk halfway around the world, lose everything that usually keeps people in place, and still preserve itself. And most importantly, the DNA of the Roma shows not one beautiful legend, but a route broken into stages, like footprints in the snow, and each stage has left its mark. And if we put them in the right order, we'll get a map, but first, a mystery. If the Roma have been in Europe for so long, why has their origin been a mystery for so long? The answer is unpleasant, but honest, because they didn't write their story. Roma have been a minority for centuries, often persecuted. Documents about them were more often created by the authorities, courts, and chroniclers, who saw them as a problem rather than people. The Roma have a rich oral tradition, music, and ancestral memory, but there are fewer written sources that would lead us to the starting point than we would like. And where there are few sources, legends are instantly stuffed there. And the first legend is so tenacious that even the name in some languages grew out of it. Gypsies, gypsies, sounds like Egyptians. Indeed, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the Roma were often called Egyptians or people from Little Egypt, hence the myth. The Roma came from Egypt, nicely, exotic, easy to remember. But here is the problem. The Romani language does not resemble ancient Egyptian and does not belong to the Afroasiatic family at all. You can hear something else in it. India is hiding there, in words and grammar. And linguists understood this long before geneticists. But linguistics can tell you the direction, and DNA can tell you the route, pace, and price of that path. So who are the Roma, and where did they come from on the road? Our story begins like a true detective story, with a conflict of versions. The first version is folk and European. They came from somewhere in the south, from Egypt or the eastern lands, and they were always wanderers. The second, scientific version, their language is Indo-Aryan, which means their roots are somewhere in the Indian subcontinent. But then a third version appears, the most cunning one. Even if the language is from India, it does not mean that the people came from there entirely. The language could have been brought by the elites, and the people could have been local. It happens that way. It happens all the time in history. Language is not always equal to blood, and this is where genetics becomes not just a clue, but a decisive clue. We start with the Y chromosome, the male line. A genetic passport that is passed down from father to son. If a people has one main point of origin, they often have a noticeable paternal autograph, a haplogroup that occurs too often to be an accident. And the Roma have such an autograph. It sounds dry, like a code, H1A1 AMA2, but there is a big sensation behind this code. This lineage is particularly characteristic of South Asia, and it is found with striking frequency in many Roma groups in Europe. This is not a light admixture or a couple of families, it's a trail that screams, the start was there, in the Indian subcontinent, and not somewhere abstractly in India, but closer to the northwestern regions, from where many migration waves have historically come. That seems to be it. Is the case closed? India, period. But no, because then the fun begins. When geneticists look not only at one line, but at the entire genome, they see that the Roma in Europe are not just Indians who left. Their genetic profile is the history of the path along which the people repeatedly passed through narrow necks, through periods of drastic population decline. And these necks leave an imprint on DNA, like folds on metal after a strong impact. What is a bottleneck in genetics? Imagine a huge river. There are thousands of streams in it, and there is a lot of variety. And then the river suddenly passes through a narrow stone tunnel, where only a few streams can squeeze through. After the tunnel, the river flows widely again, but the variety is different. Some of the streams have disappeared forever. This is how small group migration works, and this can be seen very clearly among the Roma. Many communities show signs of severe drift and isolation, traces of the fact that at some point their ancestors were a small group, which then grew. And that's where cliffhanger number 1 comes in. If the launch was in India, when exactly? And how long ago? The question seems simple, but time is an insidious thing in genetics. Because DNA doesn't keep a calendar, it stores fragment lengths, the degree of mixing, and the number of mutations. It is like ashes at the side of a bonfire. You can tell by it that there was a fire, and about when, but you need to be able to read the tracks. Genomic studies agree on one thing. The original group that gave rise to the European Roma separated from the population of northern or northwestern India about 1500 years ago, give or take. That is, approximately between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and then a fast, almost rapid march to the west, with stops and contacts, but without long century-old seats in one place. And here's cliffhanger number 2. If they were heading west, where did the first big world intercept them? Where did they first mix with the population outside India? DNA answers. Components appear on the route that are best explained by contacts with the Middle East and then with the Balkans, and then Europe. And here we have a moment that is important to understand correctly, without myths and without gross simplifications. Different Roma groups in different countries have different proportions of mixing. This is not 1% for everyone. In some places there were more marriages with the local population, in others there were fewer. Somewhere the isolation was stronger, somewhere weaker. But the overall picture is similar. European Roma have a noticeable mixture of South Asian origin with Western Eurasian components. And a significant part of this European contribution, judging by the analyses, was formed after entering the European space, starting from the Balkans and further along the path of settlement. Now the most pressing question, is it possible to date this moment of confusion? Yes, it is possible approximately. Studies that assess exactly when the South Asian and European parts of the genome began to actively mix give an estimate of about 8 to 9 centuries ago. That is, approximately in the interval that coincides with the first reliable mentions of the Roma on the territory of Byzantium and the Balkans in the 11-12 centuries. And this coincidence looks like a rare gift for a historian. A molecular clock and written sources begin to speak in unison. But here, right now, we need to pause and ask a question that reverses the whole investigation. If the Roma came to Europe around then, why did they end up everywhere so quickly? Why do we see Roma later in Central Europe, in the West, in the South, in Iberia? And why are they so different in different places, in dialects, traditions, and ways of life? They're one people, aren't they? This is where the third part of the detective story begins. Roms are not a monolith, it's a whole world inside one name. There are groups that historically followed different routes, got to different states, lived next to different peoples, adopted different words, crafts, religions, but at the same time retained the core of their identity. And genetics confirms this as well as ethnography. The Roma have a strong common base, but also a strong mosaic within Europe. This is especially noticeable among groups that have long maintained endogamy, that is, marriages mainly within their community. There, the narrow neck effect intensified, and each group became like a separate branch on a large tree. And if you think there will be a simple route map now, then no. There's going to be another twist now. Because there is a place that plays the role of not just a transit point in this story, but a major hub. These are the Balkans. The Balkans are not just about geography. This is a gigantic historical funnel, into which migrations from all sides have been drawn in different centuries. And it seems that it was there that the base was formed, from where the Roma then dispersed in waves across Europe. Not in one spurt, not in one crowd, but in a series of movements, in different ways, at different times, sometimes even in different centuries. And now the women's line, mitochondrial DNA, it is transmitted through the maternal line, from the mother to the children, and she answers the question that often decides the fate of historical reconstruction. If the people migrated as a group of families, we will see a package of both male and female lines from the original region. If the migration was predominantly male, we will see a strong male marker and a more local female set. And what do we see among the Roma? we can see that they do have characteristic maternal lines that fit well into the South Asian origin and bear the mark of the founders rather than accidental late contacts. This means an important thing: the original group was not just a squad of men. It was a community where women were also part of the migration, and that's why language and identity could be so stable. Because language is most often transmitted in the family, in everyday life, in childhood, through mothers, grandmothers, and through home life. If people have families on the road, they have a much better chance of preserving themselves. And now we can assemble the skeleton of the story. The ancestors of the Roma form as a group in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Then, about 1500 years ago, the movement to the west began. There are contacts and mixing along the way, but the key European stage begins in the Balkans about 900 years ago. Then there is the spread across Europe, and each new country, each new region adds its own layers. Some mix more strongly with the local population, others less. Some communities close down, some people move into more open social forms. The result is one nation with a common core and very different European footprints. It sounds logical. But then why are there so many strange legends around the Roma? Why Egypt? Why eternal wanderers? Why is it so difficult to bind them to one place? Because their path turned out to be perfectly visible to the neighbors and almost invisible in the documents of the Roma themselves. The Roma came to new lands as groups with an unusual language, unusual customs, and often with crafts that made them useful and alien at the same time. In some eras, they were accepted as pilgrims or people from the East. In others, they were persecuted, banned, and expelled. And the greater the pressure, the more the community closes down, the more important the internal rule of stick to your own becomes. And the more closed a community is, the stronger the genetic drift and the more pronounced the group characteristics become, which then turn people back into a mystery to the outside world. It turns out to be a vicious circle, and DNA shows that this circle is reality, not romance. But let's take a step that is usually overlooked. In the history of the Roma, there is not only from where and when, but also how. How could people go through so many different countries and still be alone? What held this identity together? Language is one of the keys. Romani is an Indo-Aryan language in which you can hear an ancient foundation related to the North Indian languages, but on top of this foundation there are layers of borrowings, like rings on a tree. There are traces of contacts on the way through the West Asian regions, then a strong Balkan layer, and then traces of European languages, depending on where the community settled. It's like a route map written not on paper, but in a dictionary. And here a beautiful trick happens. Even if the genetic mixing in some region was significant, the language could remain Romani because the community preserved the internal social structure and rules of marriage, kinship, and education of children. But cliffhanger, if there is a European part in the genome, is it possible to understand exactly where it comes from? And here the answer is unexpectedly accurate. Analyses of genomic data show that for many Roma groups, Eastern Europe and the Balkan environment were an important source of European contribution, and then local impurities were added as they moved westward, some in Central Europe, others in Iberia, and others in Northern Europe. In other words, Europe in the Roma genome is not a single source, but a series of sources spread out by geography, like paint on a map. And here we come to the most dramatic part of the investigation. Because DNA can tell not only about migration, but also about pain, when a nation experiences long-term isolation, persecution, prohibitions on marriage with the outside world, and forced resettlement. This is often reflected in demography, in how groups grow and decrease, how often the same lines are repeated, and how kinship increases within the community. Among the Roma, these signs are really noticeable in many groups, but it's important to say it right. It's not something innate. This is not a peculiarity of the people. This is a trace of the historical conditions in which the people survived as best they could. Now, the question that sounds almost provocative is, if DNA so confidently shows Indian origin, why is it still not an obvious fact in the mass consciousness? Because myths are more convenient. The Egyptian legend explains the strangeness. The eternal wanderers absolve those who have been making them wanderers by force for centuries, and people without a homeland turns the real story of migration and survival into a romantic haze. Genetics cuts through this haze. Still, the detective would have been bad if we hadn't asked the last question. If they started in India, What could be the reason for the exit? Why exactly then, 1500 years ago? The honest answer is that it's unreadable at the DNA level. Genetics shows the way and the bottlenecks, but it doesn't write reason, war or reason, economy on them. This is where the hypothesis zone begins, where you need to be careful. It could have been a complex of factors: military upheavals, a change in power, economic pressure, local conflicts, a chain of events that forced part of the community to move west. There were enough such triggers in the history of Eurasia at that time. But the main thing that DNA gives us is an understanding of scale. The starting group, according to the feelings of the genetic models, was relatively small. Not millions. And then the expansion is already on the European stage. And here's the final twist. When people hear Roma, they often represent something unified and stereotypical. And DNA shows that this is not just a mistake, it literally does not correspond to reality. The Roma in Europe are a large diaspora with a common South Asian core, but with a strong internal structure, where different branches experience different paths, different contacts, and different forms of life. And this explains why one person can hear Romani in one country and understand almost everything, while in another, only individual words. Why do some communities have stronger Balkan cultural traits, others have Central European ones, and others have Iberian ones? And why does this preserve a recognizable we, the sense of belonging? So, who are the Roma from the point of view of our DNA investigation? These are a people whose history really begins on the Indian subcontinent, whose road to the west began about 1,500 years ago, whose European chapter started through the Balkans about 9 centuries ago, and whose fate in Europe has turned into a mosaic map with different branches and different traces of mixing. This is not a legend about Egypt or a myth about people out of time. This is a specific human root that can be read from the genome, like a map, if you know where to look. And the most important thing that this conclusion gives is that it returns to the Roma what has been taken away from them for centuries: the right to a real story. Not someone else's horror story, not someone else's romanticism. It's a story that has a start, a path, forks, and survival. And now the last cliffhanger, which I will leave you specially. We have figured out where the Roma came from and how their path was imprinted in the DNA, but there is an even more pressing question. Why do the Roma have such traces of narrow necks and such a strong community structure? Is it just about external pressure, or are there mechanisms within the culture that strengthen the preservation of borders? If you want, the next issue can be about exactly this: how social rules, marriages, taboos, and isolation turn into a genetic signature. Write in the comments which branch of the Roma you want to sort out separately and in which country: the Balkans, Central Europe, Spain, Russia, Scandinavia. And yes, if you've listened to this moment, then you already understand the main thing. DNA does not confirm myths, she confirms the path.